Philipp Pattberg is the director of the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute, which is a platform for interdisciplinary research, collaboration among all faculties of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. As a full professor for transnational environmental governance and policy, he specializes in the study of global environmental politics with a focus on climate change governance, biodiversity, forest, ocean governance, transnational relations, public-private partnerships, network theory, and institutional analysis. We are very happy to have him here this morning.
Let me first of all say I'm really honored to be here, because talking about climate change is what I do for a living, but doing it at a conference organized by students of diplomacy, is a real pleasure, because I firmly believe that the skill of diplomacy is what is needed to actually address this crisis. So I think what we see today is really climate action in practice. So thank you very much to the student organizers and to all of you for doing this. It is a really great opportunity. Thanks a lot. I prepared some slides, so if you could put them up, I can show you some nice pictures. Let me start by saying that, so a lot of my students ask me, Philip, aren't you very depressed? Because you give these talks about the climate crisis a lot. And usually I say yes. But today I come with good news, actually. Because I want to argue my talk in my 10 minutes I have that actually the transition to a more sustainable future is already well underway. And we sometimes underestimate how much has already been achieved. I'm not naive. So if you say, what is he talking about after all of this sort of critical and negative talk we just heard, I acknowledge there are a lot of obstacles, but I want to show you some evidence that we're actually moving in the right direction. And I also want to talk about what we all can do to push the system further. Thank you. So, okay, excellent, thank you very much. So indeed, there's all cause for depression, because we don't have only a climate crisis, we also have a biodiversity crisis. We're also not reaching the targets for the SDGs. So overall, we're not doing very well. That doesn't necessarily mean we're not already trying. Often we confuse that a system isn't showing change for the fact that we're not trying to change the system. And that is absolutely not correct. It's like with a big supertanker that you try to stop, it will still have inertia and move on, although you have already started to change course. So it's basically saying that we are sitting in this grand transition, the biggest transition in the history of civilization probably, also the first one that we want to manage in a way, all together, collectively, consciously. And what we try to do is we want to push this ball into a different steady state. That's called a transition, and there's a theory about that, transition theory. And we're trying to push that from where we are today, an undeniable, unsustainable world, into a much more sustainable one. But the interesting question is, where are we on that transition? Are we still really down here in that very stable fossil world, or are we probably already on the way? So some of my colleagues recently, actually a month ago, published a paper in PNAS, the Prestige of the National Academy of Science. And what they concluded is, they said in this nice quote, what is needed is contagious, fast-spreading processes of social and technological change. They used these words before the corona outbreak, I guess, but what you see here is it is about contagious, fast-spreading social change, and that's what's needed. And I fully agree. That's what we have to do. But I thought about that a bit and said, maybe we're already doing that to a certain degree. So let me briefly talk about a transition. That was the standard way you would get around in Vienna or any major city, let's say in 1870, 1880. Then the number of innovations aggregated, and actually that is the way we since then have moved. But if you look closely, what we call the car today, the automotive, is basically just a horse carriage without the horses. And actually we still call the power that drives the car horsepower, right? Now that is a typical small-scale transition. A transition from one technical system to the other. But what you also need to realize is that any of those technical transitions, from the landlines to the cell phone, changes a lot of contextual structures around that. And in order to build a car, you need different skills than to build a carriage. You need different education systems. You need different regulations. You need different supply chains. So actually a lot of things are changing in response to changing one technology. So what we now have to do is we need to change all subsystems: transport, energy, education, consumption, trade, all of them at the same time, and that is called the grand transition towards sustainability. Now this is a typical sketch of a transition, and the question is, where are we? And most people, of course, following what we heard about the crisis today, would probably say we're really in the left quadrant, we're really down here, because we don't see any change. But actually, as I will show you, we're much closer to the acceleration phase. We're actually already in a substantive phase of acceleration. Because what we heard is a lot of technologies are there. A lot of insights are there. No one is actually denying that, right? We heard about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has written many reports. All of them have been agreed by all governments on the planet. It's the Intergovernmental Panel, right? So there's a broad consensus. And I want to show you actually that we did part of our homework already. Now, what I will try to convince you of is that there are 3 important key achievements we already did. And they will help us in accelerating the transition in the next 10, 15, 20 years. One is we have built stable institutions. The second is that we moved from a world of states into a world of stakeholders. And the third is probably that we move from silos to the nexus, that we actually understand that the world is connected, it's holistic. Now let me give you some insights into these 3 major achievements. Now, we have tried to build environmental institutions since the early 20th century, contracts among governments. We have accelerated that process after 1972, the first international conference on the environment in Stockholm. We've had the Rio Summit in 1992 and many other summits. And although that might seem a bit slow, you as students of diplomacy know it takes a long time to build trust and to build stable institutions. So this is one of the major achievements that we have done, because we have 2 guiding principles that will help us in the transition: the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. And they both provide a normative framework where we need to go in the next 2, 3 decades. Actually, to be very precise, now institution building is almost complete. The Paris Agreement has some unsolved issues, but probably this year they will be solved. And then we can have full speed on implementation, because we have agreed on the framework that will help us. The SDGs are already operational. It's actually 5 years already in effect. So that is something we should not forget. We've made these global agreements among divergent actors and governments, and we can be quite proud of that we have achieved that. Now, the second thing we need to realize is that we have moved very quickly from a world of states into a world of stakeholders. Now, this picture shows actually some people in my hometown of Amsterdam, and I'm not sure if you understand what they're doing here. They're fishing for plastic. And they're building ships from that plastic. In fact, the ship that they're standing in, this boat, is made from plastic from the canals in Amsterdam. And why do I show you this? Because this is one example of thousands and thousands of initiatives where people take action right there on the ground. We don't have to talk about, let's do action tomorrow. It's already happening. So research that I've done has mapped institutions, collaborations among actors, which are not including governments. And we found many, many, many global approaches that try to tackle only the climate, and I have many other on other issue areas. So in fact, we have thousands and thousands of organizations, cities, businesses, non-governmental organizations, researchers, indigenous people, religious groups, and they all work on climate action already today. That is really important to understand. We have moved from a multilateral world into a world of stakeholders. That doesn't mean everyone agrees. Far from it. But it means that we have shifted our mindset. We're not only thinking about this as an international, as a state issue. Otherwise, we wouldn't have invited industry and NGOs on that first panel. So the third thing I want to show you is that we have moved from an approach that we all know, very familiar to all of us, the silo approach, right? Because whatever you do in life, you need to specialize a lot. You need to work for one ministry. That could be the Ministry of Energy, or there's a climate ministry, but also a transport ministry, an energy ministry, and so on and so on. And that's the way we organize the world. The same for universities. You're in the Faculty of Science, maybe the Faculty of Law, maybe you're in the Faculty of Social Sciences. But actually we all have to collaborate and we need to break down those walls. So we need to move from silos to the nexus approach. These are just some random illustrations of the nexus, the idea that actually issue areas, competences, ways of life interact. And we need to realize that. And when you look at the UN, for example, we see that they have started to understand that process and are now trying to bring together all of the important international agreements on biodiversity, on climate change, on desertification, on waste, on all issues together, and they try to mainstream that. The same for the Green Deal of the European Union. It's actually the approach to say everything has to change according to the climate logic. That is really an important step that we have already taken. So I would say that is really quite good. But we don't want to be too proud, of course, otherwise some people say we stop doing stuff. That's, of course, not what I try to say. But I do want to say that there are things already underway, transitions in the social system. My colleagues call these social tipping points, where we already see really changes. So this is from an article where some of my colleagues said, so where are the systems we need to intervene in to make this rapid change? That could be the energy system, that could be settlements, so cities. It could also be about the education system, like we're in today, or it could be about norms and values. And in each of these we need to change. Now, I don't have a lot of time. I actually prepared a presentation for 1 hour, but I had to cut some slides. So I only show you 3 examples, and my argument is this is already happening. It is already happening right now. Let me start with one thing, the city revolution. There are more than 15,000 cities connected today that have more ambitious climate targets than their national governments. These cities work together. They exchange ideas, they learn, and they transition fast. Coming from Amsterdam, it's not only about canals. Amsterdam has decided that in 10 years, there will be no car in the inner city. Okay, let's do that. And the thing is, it will be great. People will love it. That came out also very importantly. It's not all about climate change. Doing this would be a good idea even if climate change wasn't real. Okay? Lower emissions, free transportation, more green space, more social interaction. These are all things we should strive for, and they are already happening at a large scale. Let me move to my next point, which is a call for divesting from bad investment. Is it happening? At a low scale, it is, but it's also accelerating. Just the other week, a number of US universities have announced to divest from fossil fuels. We have called on all universities, also in the Netherlands, to do the same. And they're considering, and it needs some more pushing, but they're on it. So this is a real important message. People realize that there are good investments and there are bad investments. And actually, this is a process that is accelerating very, very fast. I want to give you one more example. And that is about morality. I think it's actually the most important. How can we change systems? How actually have systems changed in the past? Because we have changed what we believe to be normal to be morally unacceptable. Slavery, right? Slavery has changed because we understood it's morally wrong. We have to understand that polluting the planet is morally wrong. It's not about choice. It's not about money. It's about morality. I give you one example here. A social movement that makes this argument that it's so wrong that we have to take direct action, civil disobedience. In many of the civil movements that we had, civil disobedience played a major role. And why does it work? Because it is a moral issue. Okay? If you chain yourself to something because you think something is too expensive, people will not understand. But if you do that, if you take direct action because you believe there is a moral problem, then people will follow you. And if you don't believe that that matters, I want to show you some figures from Sweden. So this is the decrease in people taking the plane. Because in Sweden and in many other countries, there's a real debate about whether flying is wrong. I'm not taking any position here. I just want to mention I took the train from Amsterdam here. Thank you. Let me add one thing that I picked up yesterday while I was on the train and reading the news. In the UK, a court has decided that Heathrow cannot expand. And the court has said this is because you signed the Paris Agreement. So this is how morality is changing. There are always, of course, shades of gray. We can discuss that later. How morality and the legal system are interacting. And I want to give you another example from the country I live in, the Netherlands. The highest court has decided that actually the government is not doing enough to meet the climate targets. And they have said you have to. Now, of course, that doesn't mean they will necessarily, but it is an important start. Now, I told you I'm not naive, so I want to, my last slide, move on to what needs to happen to keep that momentum going. So we are in a transition. We are already in an acceleration phase. That doesn't mean things cannot go wrong. Of course there are vested interest of, I don't name anyone, let's say Shell, for example, that, by the way, just recently in my country, has financed climate deniers all through the 1990s. And they've always denied doing that, but now we have proof. Good. That was just a little side note, if anyone is listening. What needs to happen to keep the momentum going? 4 points. First of all, we need collective visioning. What do I mean? We need to have much more democratic debates about how we want to live in the future. Because just reducing emission isn't a vision. It's a necessity. But how do we want to live together in 2050? This is an important process where we need, again, collaboration between different actors. We need a democratic process. Because, in a sense, 2050 could be carbon neutral, but it could be very unpleasant. But it could also be a time of collaboration, of access to education for everyone, of social justice and equity, and climate neutrality. So we need to have that visioning process, and it will help us to make those arguments. The second point, we need to move into the second, third, fourth, fifth gear very quickly. We need to accelerate. How do we do this? I have one thing, unfortunately the president already left. If politicians would just do what they promised, that already would be a great help. Now, the third point, what can you do? What can I do? What can everyone do? I get a lot of those questions also from my students. Should I go vegan? Should I take the train? You can do all these things, all good. But one thing you should do, for sure, you should hold people accountable. Okay? People are accountable for what they do in positions of power. Elected people, people in your community, people in industry. We need to hold them accountable for their actions. Every day, always when they talk, we need to remind them that they are accountable for what is happening. Climate change is not a natural catastrophe. It is a human-made catastrophe. So people are accountable. If we do that, we can move on very quickly. Now, my last point, and I kept it for last because I want to show you just a little anecdote. Now, what we need to make sure, and we heard about this before, that we rapidly also innovate disruptive technologies. We had about hydrogen a lot. There are other things we need to do. And the way to do this is to help actors by actually getting them access to funding, but also making sure that niche markets can quickly develop. Now, my anecdote is the following. This is something you see a lot in Amsterdam. It is an electric small car, and you can drive it on the cycling path. That's why people like it. The cyclists don't like it so much, but it is very handy. And there are a lot of car sharing schemes in Amsterdam. Actually, Amsterdam is the city with the most electric loading stations in the world. So you would say, great, because we have transitioned very fast into electric mobility. And in fact, I just mentioned that in 10 years there will be no combustion cars in the inner city. But I want to mention something that will shock you probably, or at least amuse you. In 1974, we already had an electric car in Amsterdam. It was actually a car sharing scheme. It's called the White Car. It is fully electric, driven by a battery, and it was operated by a computer in 1974. Incredible. What did we do? We killed it. We did nothing. It didn't innovate, it failed. This is the risk, of course, of all transitions. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that this one doesn't fail. I think we can do it, and I'm very, very positive, as you probably have heard, because I'm speaking to you, and it's your job. But actually, I really think this time, the times, they are changing. Thank you.